For most of human existence, there were no states. No capitals, no rulers, no permanent centers of command. Human life unfolded across landscapes that were not owned, but known. People lived within environments shaped by wind and water, by animals and fire, by rhythms no one could control. This stretch of time reaches so far back that it overshadows nearly everything that follows. It is not a short beginning. It is the longest condition of human life. For tens of thousands of years, people lived without permanent settlements. They moved through territories rather than occupying them. They returned to familiar places, but they did not remain. Food came from many sources. Wild plants gathered in season, roots and tubers taken from the soil, fish from rivers, lakes, and coastlines. Animals hunted across wide ranges. These were not steps in a progression. They were overlapping strategies, combined and adjusted according to place and time. No single food determined survival. When one source declined, others remained. Risk was spread across landscapes rather than concentrated in one crop or one location. Mobility made this possible. People moved when conditions changed. They followed animal migrations. They shifted camps as plants ripened and faded. Movement was not disorder. It was a strategy refined over generations. By leaving, people allowed land to recover. Plants regrew. Animal populations stabilized. Overuse was limited not by rules, but by departure. Time in this world was not counted. It was experienced. Days followed light and temperature. Years followed rain and drought. Generations followed memory and story. Knowledge accumulated slowly through observation and practice. People learned which plants nourished, which healed, and which harmed. They learned animal behavior and seasonal signs. This knowledge was local. It could not be separated from the places where it was learned. Life in this world involved uncertainty, but it was not fragile. Resilience came from flexibility, movement, and choice. For a very long time, this balance endured. Only later would conditions emerge that made staying more attractive than leaving. That story unfolds next. Mobility shaped how people faced uncertainty. In a moving world, risk was rarely concentrated. A poor season in one place did not threaten everyone. If rainfall failed, people moved. If animals shifted range, hunters followed. If plants ripened elsewhere, gatherers adjusted. Risk was spread across landscapes and seasons. Scarcity existed, but it was usually local and temporary. This distribution mattered. It prevented single failures from becoming total collapse. Health reflected this balance. Varied diets reduced nutritional stress. Movement limited the accumulation of waste. Small group size slowed the spread of illness. Disease occurred, but large epidemics were uncommon. Skeletal evidence hints at this stability. Frames were generally robust. Bodies were shaped by constant movement. Repetitive strain was limited. Work followed natural rhythms. Periods of effort were followed by rest. Seasons dictated tempo rather than schedules. Storage remained minimal. Food was consumed close to where it was found. Surplus was constrained by what could be carried. This limited accumulation. It also limited inequality. Without large stores, there was little to monopolize. Sharing was practical rather than idealistic. Excess today might be scarcity tomorrow. Reciprocity acted as insurance. Differences existed within groups. Skill, age, and experience mattered. But hierarchy remained shallow. It could not easily become permanent, because movement was always possible. If tensions grew, people left. If relations soured, groups split. Separation was easier than submission. Conflict occurred. Violence happened. But sustained domination was difficult to maintain. Power required proximity. Proximity was temporary. The landscape itself limited authority. Distance weakened command. Mobility undermined enforcement. Autonomy endured by structure, not ideology. For many millennia, this balance held. It shaped bodies, health, and expectations. Only when people began to stay longer would this equilibrium begin to change. Knowledge in the pre-state world was practical and local. It emerged from long familiarity with particular places. People learned landscapes by moving through them, by returning, by leaving again. They knew when plants appeared and faded, when animals migrated, when rivers rose and retreated. This knowledge could not be separated from experience. It could not be easily extracted or standardized. It belonged to place and memory. Because knowledge was local, it resisted centralization. No one could easily monopolize what others learned by living and moving. This shaped how leadership worked. Authority existed, but it was limited in scope. It emerged to meet specific needs. A hunt, a journey, a moment of conflict. Once the task ended, authority faded. There were no permanent offices, no standing systems of enforcement. Those who attempted to command beyond the moment encountered resistance. Often, they encountered departure. Leaving was always possible. This possibility mattered deeply. The option to walk away placed a quiet limit on domination. Coercion carried a cost when people could disperse. Power struggled to accumulate without the ability to hold people in place. Leadership, therefore, depended on persuasion rather than force, on reputation, on competence, on trust. Differences within groups were recognized. Skill mattered. Experience mattered. Age could command respect. But these distinctions remained provisional. They could be challenged. They could be ignored. They could be left behind. This prevented hierarchy from hardening. It also shaped expectation. People did not assume permanent obedience. Power was temporary, context-bound, limited in duration and reach. The environment reinforced these limits. Distance weakened command. Mobility undermined enforcement. Daily life remained difficult to oversee, complex and shifting, resistant to simplification. For a long time, this balance endured. Human life remained organized around movement rather than rule. Only when staying became more common would these limits begin to weaken. Most landscapes encouraged movement. Resources appeared briefly, then faded. Staying too long usually meant scarcity. But a small number of environments behaved differently. Wetlands, floodplains, river margins and deltas. These places renewed themselves. Seasonal floods deposited fertile silt. Plant growth followed reliably. Fish and animals returned year after year. Here, people lingered longer, not because they were forced, but because it was sensible. Returning repeatedly reduced effort. Familiar routes replaced long migrations. Seasonal camps became expected destinations. At first, little changed. People still hunted. They still gathered a wide range of foods. They still left when conditions worsened. But repetition mattered. Clearing land favored certain plants, harvesting scattered seeds near camps. Plants tolerant of disturbance thrived. Over generations, these plants changed. Seeds grew larger. Ripening became more uniform. Harvests became easier to predict. People did not plan this shift. It emerged quietly through repeated return. Stays lengthened. Storage appeared. Food was dried and cached. This was still not farming. Movement continued. Hunting and gathering remained essential, but dependence began to narrow. Certain foods mattered more than others. Leaving became less automatic. Children were born into these places. Knowledge focused more tightly on local cycles. This concentration brought benefits: less travel, more predictable food, greater seasonal stability. It also introduced risk. A poor flood affected everyone at once. Disease spread more easily as people stayed closer together. Still, people stayed, because these landscapes offered enough to justify the risk. This moment matters, not because rulers appeared. They did not. But because the balance between movement and place began to tilt. Leaving was still possible, but it was no longer automatic. The world remained without formal authority, without command, without coercion. Yet the conditions that once made domination difficult were beginning to soften. What followed was not inevitable. People still left. Settlements were abandoned. Fields returned to marsh and grass. But something new had entered the human story. Longer staying. Stored food. Greater visibility. The stage was set, not for civilization, but for a transformation that would reshape everything that followed. Some landscapes encourage movement. Others quietly invite people to stay. Wetlands, floodplains, and river margins belong to the second kind. These environments are unstable, yet predictable. They change each year, but they change in familiar ways. Floodwaters arrive with seasonal regularity. They spread across low ground. They deposit rich silt, and then they retreat. When the water pulls back, life follows. Plants grow thick and fast. Fish gather in shrinking pools. Birds arrive in large numbers. Animals follow fresh growth. In these places, food appears in dense concentration, not scattered across wide territory, but gathered in narrow zones. For mobile groups, this abundance is compelling. It reduces travel. It lowers uncertainty. It rewards return. At first, people arrive and leave as they always have. They come for the harvest. They fish while waters are low. They depart when conditions change. Over time, something subtle shifts. The cost of leaving increases. The benefit of staying becomes clearer. Familiar routes replace exploration. Seasonal camps become expected destinations. Effort shifts from searching for food to managing its timing. In these landscapes, abundance arrives all at once, and it often exceeds immediate need. So people begin to store. Food is dried, cached, kept. Storage changes the relationship between people and place. Stored food ties survival to specific locations. Leaving now means abandoning effort already invested. The longer people stay, the more they build. The more they build, the harder departure becomes. This is not force. No one compels compliance. It is attraction. A quiet gravity created by abundance. Over generations, this gravity strengthens. Children are born near stored food. Knowledge narrows to local cycles. Movement remains possible, but it becomes seasonal and predictable. People return not just because food is present, but because life is now anchored there. In landscapes of concentrated abundance, time begins to matter differently. Food no longer appears gradually across many places. It arrives in bursts. Harvests peak. Waters retreat. Animals gather. For a short window, there is more than enough. Then the window closes. This rhythm introduces a new problem: how to make abundance last. The answer is labor. Food must be processed quickly. Grain must be cut, dried, and stored. Fish must be cleaned and preserved. Roots must be prepared for keeping. This work is repetitive. It is time-sensitive. And it must be done all at once. The pace of life begins to change. Instead of moving with resources, people wait for them. They watch fields. They mark seasons. They plan around future harvests. Waiting reshapes daily life. People must remain nearby, even when food is not yet ready. Movement becomes constrained by expectation. Days organize themselves around anticipation. Labor intensifies during short, demanding periods. Grinding, drying, building storage, guarding supplies. This labor does not end when food is stored. It continues in maintenance. Containers must be repaired. Stores must be protected from animals and decay. Bodies begin to register the change. Movements narrow. Tasks repeat. Strain accumulates. Diet shifts as well. Calories increase. Variety declines. Nutrition becomes less balanced. Still, these systems persist because predictability offers security. Stored food reduces uncertainty. It promises survival through lean seasons. But predictability carries a cost. It ties people to schedules they did not previously keep. It requires coordination. And coordination creates pressure. People must arrive on time. They must work together at the same moment. They must wait when leaving would once have been easier. This is not yet command. No authority enforces compliance. But the shape of life is changing. Time itself is becoming structured. The land no longer only feeds, it schedules. When people remain in one place, their lives become easier to observe. Movement scatters activity. Staying gathers it. In mobile worlds, daily actions fade quickly. In settled places, they accumulate. Fields are worked again and again. Paths deepen with use. Storage structures rise and remain. Food that is stored must be stored somewhere, and what is stored somewhere can be found. Visibility increases without intention. It emerges through repetition. People know where food is kept. They know when it will be ready. They know who works which plots. Daily life begins to leave traces that do not disappear quickly. This alters social relationships. Contribution becomes noticeable. Absence becomes noticeable. Difference becomes harder to ignore. In mobile societies, difference dissolves with distance. In settled ones, it lingers. Who stores more? Who stores less? Who depends on whom? Visibility does not yet mean domination, but it changes expectations. Patterns of effort and reward are easier to see. Reciprocity becomes more deliberate. Obligations become easier to track. Working and waiting together require coordination. Coordination rewards regularity. Those who follow the shared rhythm benefit most. Those who do not stand out. Still, exit remains possible. People can leave. Groups can disperse. Fields can be abandoned. But the cost of leaving is higher than before. Stored food is left behind. Effort is abandoned. Social ties are disrupted. Staying begins to feel sensible, even when it is demanding. Visibility tightens not through force, but through familiarity. People know one another's routines. They notice deviation. They comment on absence. This is still not rule, not command, not law. But it is no longer invisibility. The land has begun to hold people in place. And in doing so, it has made them easier to see. Over time, repeated staying reshapes expectation. What begins as convenience becomes habit. Habit slowly becomes default. People plan less for departure and more for return. Paths are maintained rather than abandoned. Structures are repaired instead of left to decay. Children grow up within a narrower radius of movement. Their knowledge is precise, but local. They learn the seasons of one place rather than many. This shift is subtle. No decree announces it. No authority enforces it. Yet expectations change. Leaving now requires explanation. Staying requires none. Work rhythms synchronize. People arrive together. They labor together. They wait together. Coordination becomes routine. Routine becomes normal. This normality matters. It lowers resistance to shared schedules. It reduces tolerance for deviation. Those who do not align stand out more clearly. Still, this is not domination. No one commands. No one enforces. But the social field has changed. Visibility, coordination, and routine have narrowed choice. The land now anchors not only bodies, but expectations. People remain because remaining feels normal. Leaving feels disruptive. This is the threshold. A world still without rulers, still without formal authority, yet no longer fully free in its movements. What follows does not arrive as conquest. It arrives as management, as measurement, as organization. In the next part, we will see how visibility becomes counting, and how counting begins to reshape human life in lasting ways. Not all foods shape human life in the same way. Some nourish quietly. Others leave lasting traces. In the landscapes where people stayed longer, certain foods began to matter more than others. Among them, grains were distinctive. They grew in open fields. They ripened at the same time. They could be harvested in bulk. Once dried, they could be stored. This made grain visible, not just during harvest, but long afterward. Stored grain occupies space. It sits in containers. It remains in place. What remains in place can be counted. Other foods behave differently. Roots stay underground until needed. Fruit ripens gradually. Animals move on their own terms. These foods are harder to monitor, harder to measure, harder to control. Grain, by contrast, invites assessment. How much was harvested? How much remains? How long it must last? Visibility alters relationships. What can be seen can be compared. What can be compared can be judged. This judgment does not yet command, but it does not remain neutral. When food is visible, effort becomes legible. Contribution can be noticed. Absence can be noticed. Difference becomes harder to ignore. Grain does not merely feed, it records. It fixes relationships in time. Sharing begins to change character. It becomes easier to ask who owes whom, who contributed more, who contributed less, who will repay later. This does not yet produce rulers. It does not create laws. But it introduces a new condition. A world in which food can be seen is a world that can be watched. And what can be watched can eventually be managed. Once food can be seen, it can be counted. Counting begins as coordination, not command. People estimate how much was gathered, how much remains in storage, how long it must last. In mobile worlds, such calculations mattered less. Food was eaten close to its source. Surplus faded quickly. Memory guided sharing. Stored grain changes this balance. It accumulates in one place. It remains visible over time. People begin to compare, one store to another, one household to the next. Differences become clear. Some have more. Some have less. Some depend on others. Counting reshapes obligation. Reciprocity becomes more explicit. Debts become imaginable. Memory begins to harden into accounting. This does not require writing, only repetition, only comparison. Who contributed last season? Who drew from storage? Who will owe next time? Counting simplifies complex relationships. Work becomes legible through yield. Activities that produce grain gain new importance. Work that cannot be easily counted begins to matter less. Care, knowledge, movement. Counting narrows how value is understood. It reduces many forms of effort to a single measure. This simplification is powerful. It allows coordination at larger scales. It also prepares the ground for control. A world that can be counted can be compared. A world that can be compared can be ranked. And ranking quietly changes relationships. This is still not rule, not law, not command. But it is no longer neutrality. Counting makes inequality visible, and visibility invites intervention. Once counting becomes routine, it invites coordination beyond the household. Stores are compared across groups. Harvests are discussed collectively. Shortfalls are anticipated. Measurement begins to guide action. When supplies run low, distribution is adjusted. When yields are high, storage is expanded. These responses feel practical. They feel sensible. They feel necessary. Management emerges quietly, not as domination, but as organization. Decisions are made about timing, about allocation, about priorities. Someone must decide when stores are opened. Someone must decide how much is released. Someone must decide who receives it. At first, these roles rotate. They're justified by experience, by knowledge of seasons, by familiarity with stores. But repetition matters. Those who manage today are expected to manage again. Competence becomes expectation. Expectation becomes role. Roles begin to persist. This persistence is subtle. No proclamation marks it. No ceremony establishes it. But over time, patterns settle. Certain people become associated with coordination, with storage, with decision-making. Management begins to shape behavior. People adjust effort to expected outcomes. They work toward measurable targets. They align activity with shared schedules. Deviation becomes more noticeable. Non-participation becomes harder to justify. This is not yet coercion. No force is applied, but choices narrow. Participation becomes normal. Compliance becomes convenient. Management depends on visibility. What cannot be seen cannot be managed. So attention focuses on what is countable, what is storable, what is predictable. Activities outside this frame fade from consideration. Mobility becomes inconvenient. Diversity becomes inefficiency. Complexity becomes a problem to solve. This shift changes social life. It rewards conformity. It discourages departure. It stabilizes patterns that were once fluid. Still, this is not the state. No laws yet bind. No authority yet commands. But the groundwork is laid. Measurement has become management. And management is a step toward control. As management settles in, choice begins to narrow. Not through force, not through decree, but through habit. Routines form around shared schedules. Work aligns with expected outputs. Time is organized around harvest and storage. What fits these rhythms is encouraged. What does not becomes difficult. Mobility, once normal, now disrupts planning. Diversity of subsistence complicates accounting. Activities that cannot be measured are harder to justify. Leaving carries new costs. Stored food is forfeited. Social obligations are broken. Future claims are lost. Staying becomes easier than departure. Participation becomes expectation. Those who align benefit from stability. Those who do not stand out. Attention follows visibility. Effort is noticed when it produces countable results. Work outside this frame receives less recognition. Care, knowledge, seasonal movement. These forms persist, but their value is diminished. Over time, people adjust themselves to what is rewarded. They plan lives around predictable returns. They invest effort where it will be seen. This adjustment feels voluntary. No one is compelled. But alternatives fade. The range of acceptable behavior contracts. Variation gives way to regularity. Regularity gives way to norm. The land still feeds. Stores still sustain. But life is now organized around fewer choices than before. This narrowing does not announce itself. It accumulates gradually, through repetition, through expectation, through the quiet pressure to fit. By the time it is noticed, it feels natural, normal, inevitable. But it is not inevitable. It is the product of specific arrangements, of visible food, of counting, of management. These arrangements prepare the ground for what comes next. Not rule yet, not law yet, but a world increasingly ready to be ruled. Staying in one place changes the body. Movement once shaped daily life. Now, repetition does. Tasks return each day. Fields are worked again and again. Tools are used in the same motions. Effort concentrates in particular muscles. Time concentrates in particular places. Sedentary life brings stability. It also brings strain. Work becomes narrower. Grinding, carrying, digging. These tasks repeat without long interruption. Rest follows schedules rather than seasons. Bodies adapt, but not without cost. Archaeological remains record these changes. Joints show signs of wear. Spines compress under repeated load. Teeth bear the marks of harder, more starchy diets. Calories may increase. Nutrition often declines. Variety narrows. Dependence deepens. Illness behaves differently here. Closer living spreads infection. Waste accumulates near dwellings. Parasites find stable hosts. Disease becomes a recurring presence rather than a passing event. Still, people remain, because staying offers predictability. Stored food promises survival. Permanent shelters promise protection. The costs are gradual. They accumulate slowly, often unnoticed by those who bear them. Children grow into this rhythm. They do not remember a world of wide movement. What once felt restrictive now feels ordinary. Sedentary life reshapes expectation. Effort is assumed. Waiting is normalized. Endurance becomes virtue. The body adapts to the demands placed upon it. But adaptation does not mean improvement. It means accommodation. A trade is made. Mobility for predictability. Variety for stability. Freedom of movement for assurance of return. This trade does not end the story. It deepens it. Because bodies are not the only things reshaped by staying. Social life changes as well. That change comes next. As life settles in one place, labor changes its meaning. Work is no longer episodic. It becomes continuous. Tasks must be performed not just when resources appear, but every day. Fields require tending long before harvest. Storage requires constant attention. Structures must be repaired. Tools must be maintained. Labor is no longer tied only to immediate reward. Much of it is preparation. Work now serves the future. This creates obligation. Someone must plant before anyone can eat. Someone must guard stores through seasons of waiting. Effort is demanded long before benefit arrives. In mobile worlds, refusal was simple. People left. In settled worlds, refusal is more visible. Absence is noticed. Non-participation stands out. Work becomes moralized. Those who labor are seen as contributors. Those who do not are questioned. Endurance becomes valued. The ability to persist, to continue, to remain is praised. Suffering is reframed as commitment. Fatigue becomes expected. Rest becomes conditional. The rhythms of work tighten social bonds. They also constrain them. Daily cooperation makes withdrawal difficult. Leaving now disrupts others' labor. It threatens shared outcomes. Obligation deepens without the need for force. People stay because others depend on them. Dependence binds. Endurance becomes social glue. Over time, this endurance reshapes identity. People define themselves by the work they sustain, by their reliability, by their presence. Labor is no longer only physical. It becomes social. It signals belonging. It marks inclusion. To work is to belong. To withdraw is to risk exclusion. This shift prepares the ground for something new, a world where obligation can be demanded, where endurance can be enforced, not yet through command, not yet through law, but through expectation that feels unavoidable. Staying together changes how illness behaves. In mobile worlds, people rarely remained close for long. In settled places, proximity becomes constant. Homes cluster. Paths intersect. Water sources are shared. This closeness has consequences. Infection spreads more easily. Parasites find stable hosts. Waste accumulates near dwellings. Illness becomes persistent. No longer an interruption, but a background condition. Children grow up exposed to the same pathogens year after year. Bodies adapt, but at a cost. Immunity develops unevenly. Vulnerability concentrates among the young and the weak. Crowding also reshapes dependence. When many live together, failure is shared. A bad season affects everyone at once. Disease moves through households without regard for effort. In response, reliance deepens. People depend more on stored food, on collective labor, on shared protection. This dependence tightens bonds. It also reduces options. Leaving while sick is dangerous. Leaving without support is risky. Remaining becomes the safer choice. Health becomes collective. So does vulnerability. Care becomes organized around proximity. But care, like labor, is not evenly valued. Some forms are visible, others are not. The visible gains recognition. The invisible is assumed. Crowding amplifies hierarchy without naming it. Those who manage stores become crucial. Those who coordinate labor gain influence. Those who depend have fewer choices. Illness makes absence costly. Dependency makes exit difficult. Together, they bind people more tightly to place and to one another. This binding is not yet enforced, but it is increasingly hard to escape. Crowding, disease, and dependence do not create authority, but they prepare conditions in which authority can persist. As people stay in one place, their lives become easier to describe in simple terms. Where they live, what they grow, what they store. This simplicity is new. In mobile worlds, life resisted summary. Activities shifted by season and place. People were difficult to track. In settled worlds, patterns stabilize. Homes remain. Fields endure. Stores persist. This stability invites description. People begin to be seen not only as individuals, but as units. Households, plots of land, stores of grain. Units can be compared. They can be counted. They can be ranked. This is not yet domination. It begins as administration. Who occupies which field? Who contributes to which store? Who depends on which supply? Complex lives are reduced to visible markers. Yield replaces effort. Storage replaces variety. Presence replaces movement. This reduction is powerful. It makes coordination easier. It also strips away nuance. Work that cannot be seen is harder to recognize. Knowledge that cannot be counted is easier to ignore. People begin to adjust to how they are seen. They focus effort where it will be noticed. They organize life around what can be recorded. Being legible becomes advantageous. Being obscure becomes risky. Those who fit the visible categories benefit from inclusion. Those who do not begin to stand apart. Legibility does not yet command, but it creates a new relationship between people and power. A relationship mediated by simplified representations of complex lives. Once lives can be summarized, they can be managed. And management, once established, rarely remains neutral. To manage what is visible, it must first be named. Naming fixes identity. It turns people, places, and activities into stable references. A household gains a name. A field gains a boundary. A store gains a measure. Once named, these elements can be listed. Lists bring order. They arrange complexity into sequence. What was once fluid becomes discrete. Who lives here? What they produce? What they owe? Lists do not capture life as it is lived. They capture life as it is seen from above, from a distance, from an administrative view. This view privileges regularity. What fits the list is real. What does not is easily overlooked. Movement disappears from records. Seasonal variation fades. Informal exchange is difficult to note. Simplification makes management possible. It also creates distortion. Lives are richer than their summaries, but summaries guide decisions. Resources are allocated based on what appears on lists. Obligations are assigned to named units. Responsibility becomes attached to fixed identities. People begin to experience themselves through these categories: as contributors, as dependents, as compliant or irregular. The list becomes a mirror. Not an accurate one, but a powerful one. To fall outside it is to risk invisibility. To resist it is to invite attention. Simplification accelerates coordination. It also narrows acceptable behavior. Diversity becomes deviation. Adaptation becomes disorder. What cannot be easily named becomes a problem to solve. Lists do not force compliance. but they create expectations that shape choice. To appear on the list is to belong. To be omitted is to stand apart. Over time, people learn to live in ways that are legible. They align themselves with what can be recorded, what can be listed, what can be measured. This alignment feels practical. It also prepares the ground for stronger forms of control. Because once lives are simplified, they can be directed. And direction is never far from command. Once lives can be seen clearly, they can be directed. Legibility makes intervention possible. Not immediately, not always deliberately, but steadily. When people are known as units, they can be addressed as units. Instructions replace suggestions. Expectations replace negotiation. What begins as coordination shifts toward regulation. Fields are not only recorded, they are scheduled. Stores are not only observed, they are allocated. Labor is not only counted, it is required. This requirement does not yet arrive as force. It arrives as necessity, as the logic of an organized system. Once plans depend on participation, non-participation becomes a problem. Absence disrupts schedules. Refusal undermines planning. Deviation introduces risk. In response, pressure increases, not always through punishment, often through obligation, through reminders of dependence, through appeals to contribution. Legibility changes how power operates. It no longer needs to persuade everyone. It only needs compliance from those it can see. Those who fall outside the records become suspicious. Those who do not conform are marked as irregular. Control tightens first around what is most visible. Grain stores, labor schedules, households that remain in place. Mobility becomes a challenge to management. Complexity becomes inefficiency. Variation becomes risk. Simplified lives are easier to direct. And direction, once normalized, hardens into authority. At this point, the shift is still incomplete. Rules exist, but enforcement is uneven. Obligations exist, but escape is still possible. Yet the relationship has changed. People no longer relate to power only through encounter. They relate to it through records, expectations, and schedules. Legibility has created a surface on which control can operate. What comes next is not sudden domination. It is consolidation. The gradual tightening of systems already in place. The emergence of authority that can persist. At first, obligation feels shared. Everyone depends on the same stores. Everyone waits on the same seasons. Participation appears voluntary. But as systems grow, dependence deepens. Plans require reliable labor. Storage requires regular contribution. Coordination requires attendance. Absence becomes disruptive. Refusal becomes costly. At this point, expectation begins to harden. What was once requested is now assumed. What was once shared is now required. Labor is no longer only cooperative, it becomes obligatory. Those who fail to meet expectations face consequences. At first, these are social: loss of standing, reduced access to stores, public disapproval. Over time, sanctions formalize. Access is conditional. Support is withheld. Participation is enforced through exclusion. This is coercion in its earliest form. Not violence, not yet, but constraint. Choice narrows further. To comply is to eat. To refuse is to risk hunger. The moral language shifts. Work becomes duty. Contribution becomes obligation. Endurance becomes expectation. Those who enforce these expectations begin to stand apart. They are not yet rulers, but they occupy a different position. They oversee stores. They schedule labor. They judge compliance. Their role is justified as necessity, as order, as survival. And often it is. But necessity normalizes coercion. What is required to maintain the system becomes unquestionable. Exit becomes dangerous. Leaving means abandoning stores, abandoning protection, abandoning community. For many, staying is the only viable option. Coercion has not arrived as conquest. It has emerged from dependence, from management, from systems that now require compliance to function. Coercion becomes complete when exit is no longer viable. For much of human history, leaving was the ultimate safeguard. If demands grew too heavy, people moved. If authority pressed too hard, groups dispersed. But settled life weakens this option. Stored food cannot be carried far. Fields cannot be taken along. Shelters bind people to place. Dependence accumulates quietly. Leaving now means starting over with nothing. For many, this is not a real choice. Labor becomes the condition of survival, not occasional labor, not negotiated labor, but continuous obligation. Those who control access to food control life itself. They need not threaten violence. They need only withhold support. Captivity emerges without walls. People are held by necessity, by hunger, by illness, by obligation. This captivity is uneven. Some retain resources, some retain mobility, others do not. Those without stores must work for access. Those without protection must submit for security. Labor becomes extracted rather than offered. It is directed toward maintaining the system, toward filling stores, toward building infrastructure, toward sustaining those who organize and oversee. Violence remains rare at first. It does not need to be frequent. The threat of deprivation is sufficient. Over time, this arrangement stabilizes. Children are born into it. They do not remember a world where exit was easy. Captivity becomes normal. Labor becomes destiny. This is the moment when coercion fully arrives, not as spectacle, not as conquest, but as structure. A structure that channels effort in one direction, upward, toward stores, toward managers, toward an emerging center. The state has not yet appeared, but the conditions it requires are now in place. People are visible, counted, bound to place, and unable to leave without unacceptable risk. When coercion stabilizes, it begins to organize itself. What was once dispersed draws inward. Grain accumulates in central locations. Labor is directed toward shared storehouses. These centers matter. They concentrate surplus. They fix value in one place. They make control efficient. Where food gathers, authority gathers with it. Those who oversee stores gain influence. They regulate access. They schedule distribution. They decide priorities. This role becomes permanent, not because of ambition alone, but because the system depends on continuity. Surplus cannot manage itself. Coordination must persist through seasons and generations. Authority begins to detach from particular individuals. It attaches instead to positions, to offices, to roles that endure. This is a critical shift. Power is no longer situational. It no longer dissolves when the task ends. It remains. Centers grow. People are drawn toward them for protection, for food, for opportunity. Density increases. Visibility sharpens. Control becomes easier. Authority now operates through routine, through schedules, through expectation. Violence is no longer the foundation. It becomes the reserve. Most compliance is achieved through dependence and habit. People work because work is required. They deliver surplus because delivery is expected. They obey because obedience feels normal. At this stage, the state is not yet formalized. There may be no written law, no standing army, but the shape is visible. A center that gathers, a population that supplies, an authority that endures. The system now requires maintenance, and maintenance requires expansion. To survive, the center must grow. That pressure defines what comes next. Once authority stabilizes, it requires regular input. Centers must be fed. Officials must be supported. Stores must remain full. What began as shared surplus becomes obligation. A portion of each harvest is now expected, not as gift, but as due. This is taxation in its earliest form. It does not begin with money. It begins with grain. Grain is ideal for extraction. It is visible, measurable, storable. Its harvest is predictable. Its yield can be assessed. Other foods are less cooperative. They ripen gradually. They spoil quickly. They resist monitoring. Authority therefore favors what can be taken easily, what can be counted, what can be moved to central stores. Taxation reshapes production. People are encouraged to grow what can be extracted. Diversity declines. Uniformity increases. Fields begin to resemble one another. This uniformity simplifies control. It also increases vulnerability. Failure now affects everyone at once. Yet expansion continues. Centers require more surplus to sustain themselves. Officials multiply. Infrastructure grows. Walls are built. Roads are maintained. Labor is drawn inward. Extraction intensifies. To meet demand, production must increase. Fields expand. Work intensifies. Dependence deepens. Expansion becomes necessity. The center cannot contract without collapse. It must grow or fail. This logic drives authority outward, into new fields, new populations, new sources of labor. The state begins to reach, not yet far, but persistently. Expansion is justified as order, as stability, as protection. Often it provides all three, but it also binds more people to its logic, a logic that demands surplus, that demands labor, that demands growth. For all their power, early centers are fragile. They depend on constant flow. Grain must arrive on time. Labor must continue without interruption. Authority must be obeyed day after day. This dependence creates weakness. A missed harvest ripples outward. A disrupted labor cycle threatens stores. Disease spreads quickly through dense populations. Unlike mobile societies, centers cannot easily adapt. They are fixed in place, bound to fields, bound to stores. Uniform crops magnify risk. A single blight can undo years of accumulation. Floods and droughts strike whole regions at once. Recovery is slow. Authority responds by tightening control. Extraction increases. Obligations grow heavier. This response often worsens collapse. Overworked populations weaken. Fields degrade. Surplus shrinks further. Collapse does not arrive dramatically. It unfolds gradually. Through abandonment, through flight, through refusal. People leave when they can. They return to mobility, to marginal lands, to subsistence that escapes control. From the center's perspective, this is failure. From the people's perspective, it is survival. Archaeological records reveal repeated cycles. States rise, states fragment, states vanish, often quickly, often violently. But disappearance does not end life. Populations persist beyond the state. They adapt. They move. They reorganize. Fragility is not a flaw. It is the cost of concentration. The more surplus is gathered, the more catastrophic its loss. The more tightly controlled life becomes, the more brittle the system. Early states, therefore, live in a constant tension between growth and collapse, between order and flight, between authority and escape. This tension defines their long-term trajectory, and it opens the door to alternatives. For as long as states have existed, people have lived beyond them. Not always in opposition, not always in conflict, often simply elsewhere. When centers tighten control, movement becomes strategy. People leave fields and stores behind. They move toward terrain that resists administration. Hills, forests, marshes. These landscapes frustrate visibility. They scatter activity. They complicate counting. They reward mobility over storage. Life beyond the state often looks poorer from the center. Yield is lower. Storage is minimal. But autonomy is greater. Risk is managed through movement and diversity. People choose foods that resist extraction, roots that grow underground, plants that ripen at different times, animals that cannot be penned easily. These choices are not primitive. They are deliberate. They reduce visibility. They frustrate taxation. Refusal does not always announce itself. It may take the form of migration, of seasonal absence, of partial participation. People move in and out of state spaces. They trade when useful. They retreat when demands grow. This flexibility preserves choice. States describe such populations as marginal, as backward, as unruly. But these descriptions reflect administrative frustration, not failure. From outside the state, collapse at the center is not disaster. It is opportunity. Fields revert to grass. Storehouses empty. People disperse. Life continues in new forms. For much of history, non-state life outlasts state life. States rise and fall. Avoidance persists. Mobility endures. This persistence matters. It reveals that the state is not the natural endpoint of human organization. It is one arrangement among many, and it has always had limits. Resistance does not always announce itself. It does not require banners or confrontation. Often, it takes quieter forms. People comply on the surface while adjusting beneath. They deliver what is demanded, but no more. They meet obligations in ways that preserve autonomy. Fields are planted, but yields are understated. Stores are filled, but some surplus is hidden. Labor is offered, but effort is calibrated. These practices are difficult to detect. They leave no monuments. They generate no proclamations. Yet they shape outcomes. States depend on legibility. They rely on what can be seen, counted, and recorded. When people blur these measures, control weakens. Knowledge is kept local. Techniques are shared informally. Practices adapt faster than administration can follow. Resistance also takes the form of timing. Participation is delayed. Attendance is partial. Compliance arrives late. These delays strain systems that require synchrony. Harvest schedules slip. Labor plans unravel. Authority responds by demanding clarity. But clarity invites evasion. The more rules proliferate, the more workarounds emerge. This form of resistance rarely seeks to overthrow. Its aim is endurance, to remain within reach but not fully captured. People learn how far they can bend without breaking. They maintain space within constraint. From the perspective of authority, this looks like inefficiency. From below, it is survival. Rebellion is risky. Avoidance is safer. By staying ambiguous, people preserve exit routes. By remaining partially legible, they limit extraction. This quiet resistance does not stop the state, but it slows it. It blunts its reach, and it explains why authority must constantly reinforce itself. The state is never complete. It is always contested, not only at its borders, but within its daily routines. The boundary between state and non-state life is not fixed. It shifts over time. It advances and retreats. When centers are strong, they draw people inward. They offer protection. They promise stability. During periods of abundance, life within the state can appear attractive. Food is available. Work is organized. Risk feels contained. In these moments, populations concentrate. Fields expand. Stores fill. Authority strengthens. But this concentration carries tension. As extraction increases, burden grows. Labor intensifies. Obligations multiply. Resilience declines. A shock arrives. Drought, flood, disease, or war. Suddenly, the advantages of concentration vanish. Stores empty. Protection falters. Authority tightens its grip. Demands increase, just as capacity weakens. At this point, movement resumes. People leave. Some flee quietly, others in large waves. They return to margins, to uplands, to forests, to wetlands and borderlands. From the center's view, this is collapse. From below, it is adaptation. Non-state zones expand during periods of state weakness. They absorb people, knowledge, and skills. These zones are not empty. They are full of history, full of strategies developed over generations. When conditions improve, the cycle reverses. States re-emerge. Centers are rebuilt. Surplus accumulates again. Populations drift back, not always willingly, often drawn by opportunity, sometimes compelled by force. This movement is not linear. It repeats, over centuries, over millennia. The long record of human history is not one of steady progress toward states. It is a rhythm. Concentration and dispersal. Capture and escape. Order and refusal. States appear powerful when viewed briefly. Over deep time, they are episodic. What persists is not authority, but adaptability. The ability to move, to reorganize, to live beyond imposed structures. This does not romanticize life outside the state. It recognizes choice. Choice constrained, but not erased. The history of flight and return reveals a central truth. The state is never the final form. It is one moment within a much longer human story. Civilization is often described as a straight line, a movement from simplicity toward complexity, from freedom toward order, from small groups toward states. But the long record of human life does not support this story. For most of our past, states were absent. When they appeared, they were fragile. When they failed, life continued. Progress, viewed from above, looks like accumulation. More people, more surplus, more control. Viewed from below, it often looks different. Longer work, narrower diets, reduced mobility. Early states grew by concentrating effort. They did not necessarily improve life for those who sustained them. Health often declined. Risk increased. Obligation deepened. None of this denies the achievements of complex societies. Writing, architecture, long-distance trade. These emerged within states, but they came at a cost. That cost was borne unevenly. Order benefited some more than others. Security was selective. Stability depended on extraction. When civilization is measured only by monuments and records, much is missed. Those records reflect the center. They rarely capture avoidance. They rarely record flight. Yet these strategies were common responses. For many, leaving the state was a rational choice, not a failure, not regression, but adaptation. Progress is therefore ambiguous. It depends on perspective, on whose labor is counted, on whose suffering is ignored. The idea of civilization as an unquestioned good emerges from the state itself. It is a story told by those who benefited most. A longer view complicates that story. It reveals trade-offs, losses, alternatives. Civilization is not destiny. It is a choice, repeated and revised across time. Order is often treated as progress. It promises predictability, security, continuity. But order is never free. It is produced, maintained, enforced. In early states, order emerged from concentration. People were gathered. Labor was synchronized. Surplus was centralized. This made life predictable for those at the center. For those at the margins, it often meant constraint. Freedom in non-state worlds looked different. It was not limitless. It involved uncertainty. Risk was real. Failure was personal. But choice remained wider. People could leave. They could adapt. They could reorganize quickly. States reduced some dangers while amplifying others. Famine became less frequent in good years, but when it came, it was catastrophic. Violence became organized. Protection became conditional. The trade-off is clear. Stability required submission. Security required labor. Order required obedience. This exchange was not equally negotiated. Those who managed stores shaped the terms. Those who worked the fields absorbed the costs. Over time, this imbalance hardened into structure. The benefits of order flowed upward. The burdens of maintenance flowed downward. Freedom was not eliminated. It was narrowed. Choice remained, but within defined limits. To live within the state was to accept those limits. To live outside it was to accept different risks. Neither option was simple. Neither was universally better. The human story is not a tale of replacing freedom with order. It is a history of bargaining between them. Across time, across landscapes, across generations. Understanding civilization requires seeing both sides of that bargain. Not only what was gained, but what was given up. Only then can the past be read without illusion. The first states did not disappear without trace. Even when they collapsed, their patterns endured. Ways of seeing persisted. Ways of measuring remained. Ways of organizing life left deep impressions. Later states inherited these templates. They refined them, expanded them, embedded them more deeply. Counting became more precise. Records became permanent. Authority became harder to escape. Yet the logic remained recognizable. Visibility enabled control. Concentration invited fragility. Expansion demanded extraction. These dynamics did not belong only to the distant past. They reappear whenever systems grow large, whenever administration simplifies life to make it manageable, whenever efficiency replaces diversity. Modern societies are not replicas of early states, but they echo them. Surveillance replaces counting. Documentation replaces lists. Institutions replace storehouses. The tools change. The impulse does not. People are still rendered legible. Lives are still simplified to fit systems. Compliance is still rewarded. Deviation is still managed. This continuity matters. It reveals that the state is not a finished project. It is an ongoing negotiation between order and autonomy, between visibility and freedom, between efficiency and resilience. The earliest states teach caution. They show how easily systems that promise stability can erode choice. They show how concentration creates vulnerability. They show how progress is never neutral. Understanding these origins does not demand rejection of complex societies. It demands awareness. Awareness of trade-offs. Awareness of costs. Awareness of alternatives. The deep past does not offer simple lessons, but it offers perspective. A reminder that human life has taken many forms, and may yet take many more. The story of the first states does not end with dominance. It ends with complexity. with systems that endure only by constant adjustment. With people who comply, but also adapt. Avoidance never vanished. It changed form. It moved into margins, into timing, into partial participation. Even within large systems, people preserve spaces of autonomy. They shape lives around what cannot be fully captured. Relationships, knowledge, care. These elements resist simplification. They persist because they must. The first states sought permanence. They rarely achieved it. Their ruins remind us that no system is final, no structure eternal. Human societies are provisional. They form, they strain, they change. What endures is not any single arrangement, but the capacity to adapt, to move when necessary, to reorganize, to choose differently. The deep past shows that civilization was not inevitable. It was assembled, maintained, contested. It also shows that alternatives never disappeared. They waited at the edges. They persisted in practice. They re-emerged when conditions allowed. To understand the first states is not to reject order. It is to recognize how fragile order can be, how dependent on consent, on labor, on visibility, and how quickly it unravels when those supports withdraw. The story that began before the state does not end with it. It continues in every negotiation between control and autonomy, in every choice between concentration and resilience, in every moment when people decide how much of themselves to make visible. The past does not instruct. It illuminates. It widens the frame. It reminds us that the human story has always been larger than the structures built to contain it.